Welcome to my YouTube channel, Tony Style Motivation. This isn't just another motivational page. This is a wake-up call. Here, we don't sugarcoat, we don't play small. We break cycles, we rewrite mindsets, and we take back our power one truth at a time. If you're tired of chasing people who don't value you, if you're done being stuck in the same patterns, if you're ready to become the strongest, most unshakable version of you, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, because the real shift, it starts now. You know, there's a moment, a critical moment, when something inside you finally shifts. Not out of bitterness, not out of revenge, but because you finally had enough. You've hit a threshold, that point where your soul just says, no more over-explaining yourself, no more apologizing for needing connection, no more bending over backwards for someone who keeps pulling away. The moment you show up fully, that's the moment when you stop chasing, and that's where everything begins to change. Because here's what people don't understand: silence is not retreat. Silence is not defeat. It's a decision. It's a conscious move to stop giving your energy to something that is no longer aligned with your worth. That withdrawal isn't passive. It's not resignation, it's power. It's the moment you reclaim the very energy you've been leaking. And the second you stop trying to be seen, something shifts in them, because now you're invisible and they never thought you would be. They counted on you to keep trying, to keep texting, to keep reaching out. They built the whole dynamic on the fact that you were the emotionally available one. You were the one who cared more. You were the one who fought harder, and they liked that, not because they didn't care at all, but because they didn't have to do the heavy lifting. They could sit back and let you carry the emotional burden. But when you stop, when you step back, and you go silent, suddenly the whole game collapses. You see, avoidants thrive on space. They've trained themselves to believe that independence equals safety, that distance keeps them in control, but it's only because they've never been forced to confront what real emotional intimacy looks like. They've never had to deal with someone removing their energy completely. Your silence becomes a vacuum, and that vacuum pulls their unresolved fears right to the surface. Now, they're sitting with questions they can't shake off. Why aren't you calling? What happened to the person who always cared? Did they stop loving me? Are they talking to someone else? And those questions, they aren't just about you, they're about them. Your silence is forcing them to meet parts of themselves they've avoided their entire life. And here's the paradox: the more silent you become, the louder your absence gets. The more still you are, the more noise it creates in their head. That space you left behind, it echoes. Because suddenly, they realize you're not chasing anymore, you're not explaining, you're not trying to earn your spot. And that realization, it's jarring, it's confusing, and most of all, it's threatening to the dynamic they were comfortable in. But the real magic, it's what happens inside you during that silence. Because in that stillness, you start to feel yourself come back online. You start hearing your own voice again. The one that got drowned out by emotional chaos. The one that kept whispering you deserve more, even when you kept settling for less. That silence doesn't just shake them, it heals you. You start to remember your worth. You start to reconnect with your standards. You begin to realize that love isn't supposed to feel like convincing someone to stay. And that's when something incredible happens. You stop needing closure. You stop needing them to understand what they did. You stop needing to be validated, because your silence is the closure. Your silence is the boundary. It says everything that your words couldn't. It says, I'm done handing over my peace just to feel temporarily wanted. And look, it doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean the silence doesn't come with its own kind of pain, but it's a clean pain, the kind that leads to healing, not more confusion. The kind that says, this hurts, but it's right. And that's where your real power comes from doing what's hard, from holding the silence long enough to transform in it. So if you've pulled back, if you've gone quiet, if you've chosen not to engage with someone who keeps emotionally abandoning you, understand this: you didn't give up. You chose growth. You didn't walk away because you're weak. You walked away because you're done betraying yourself to keep someone else comfortable. And now they're the one who has to sit with the silence, not you. Here's what most people completely miss when it comes to avoidant behavior. They think avoidants are immune to emotion. They think because they act cold, detached or indifferent, they don't feel anything, but that's not true. That's never been true. Avoidants do feel, they just bury it. They push it down, pack it away, and convince themselves they're above it, but silence, real silence, intentional, calm, grounded silence. It breaks through that armor like nothing else can. It doesn't yell, it doesn't accuse, it doesn't beg. It just sits there and demands to be felt. When you go quiet, you pull away the emotional scaffolding they've relied on. You remove the soft landing, and in that space, they're forced to meet something they spend their whole lives avoiding, their own emptiness. Your silence doesn't give them the usual distractions. It doesn't offer the comfort of knowing you'll always be there, always reaching out, always closing the gap. Instead, it creates space, and that space, it feels like chaos to them, because underneath their calm exterior is something they don't want to admit: fear, a deep, unresolved fear of being vulnerable, a fear of relying on someone else, a fear of needing you, because needing means the risk of being hurt. And so they create distance, they pull away, they intellectualize everything. But when you go quiet, when you stop responding, when you stop showing up emotionally, that distance becomes real, and it terrifies them. They won't say it out loud most of the time. They don't even consciously recognize it, but their body knows, their nervous system knows, and it responds with anxiety, doubt, confusion, even regret. Suddenly the dynamic has flipped. You're not the one chasing, you're not the one seeking reassurance, they are. See, what your silence does is force a confrontation with the emotional parts of themselves they've long disconnected from. It's not just about you not texting. It's not just about you pulling away. It's what it represents. It symbolizes the very thing they were trying to avoid by keeping you at arm's length: loss, abandonment, disconnection. And now, it's not just a hypothetical anymore. It's happening, and it's because of your choice, not their decision, that hits differently. They start wondering if maybe they misjudged you. Maybe you were stronger than they thought. Maybe you're not sitting there crying, waiting, hoping. Maybe, just maybe, you're done, and that possibility starts to eat at them, not because they're ready to fully engage, not because they suddenly understand how to show up with love, but because they're no longer in control. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, control is safety. Your silence removes that safety. Now they're asking questions they never had to ask before. Why didn't they reach out? Do they even care anymore? Have they moved on? And those questions start turning inward. Did I mess this up? Was I too cold? Did I push away something real? And that's the space where growth can happen, not always, but it becomes possible. And it was your silence that cracked that door open. That's the power of doing nothing externally, but everything internally. You're not lashing out. You're not trying to teach them a lesson. You're just refusing to engage in the cycle anymore. You're done pouring love into a container with no bottom. And now they're left with the weight of what they couldn't or wouldn't give. But the beauty of it is, this isn't even about punishing them. It's about elevating you. It's about choosing peace over chaos, dignity over desperation. It's about finally seeing that your worth was never tied to their recognition of it. And in doing that, in holding your silence not from anger, but from self-respect, you send a message more powerful than any words ever could, and they feel it. Don't let the silence fool you. Behind those quiet days and delayed responses and distant behaviors is a storm. They may never admit it, but that stillness you chose, that moment you stopped trying, it shook something in them they didn't know could be touched. Because your silence didn't just end the conversation, it started the one they've been avoiding with themselves their whole life. There's a moment where you stop trying to be understood and start choosing to understand yourself. That moment is quiet. There's no applause, no dramatic scene, no explanation, just stillness, just you finally stepping out of a cycle that's been draining the very life out of you. And for the first time, you realize you've been giving your identity away, one emotional compromise at a time. Not because you're weak, not because you're desperate, but because you loved deeply. You showed up fully, and in doing that, you kept waiting for someone to meet you where you already were. But they never did. Avoidants don't usually ask you to shrink. They just reward you when you do. You start softening, you truths, tiptoeing around their triggers, silencing your needs, because every time you were honest, they pulled away, and your nervous system learned, don't disrupt the peace, don't ask for too much, don't be the reason they leave. So you started morphing, you started bending, you became someone they could tolerate, instead of staying someone you could be proud of. But the most dangerous thing you can do in a relationship is abandon yourself just to keep someone else. And that's what so many people in these dynamics don't realize until much later, that every unanswered question, every brushed off feeling every time you said it's okay, when it wasn't, that all of it was slowly stripping you of your own voice. And when that happens long enough, you start to forget who you were before all the emotional negotiation. But then comes the silence, not the silence they gave you, the silence you chose, and that silence, it brings you home to yourself. Because when you stop reacting, when you stop performing, when you stop showing up just to prove your worth, what you're really doing is reconnecting with your identity. You're no longer begging to be seen, you're seeing yourself, and that shift is everything. Because now, it's not about getting their attention, it's about reclaiming yours. You start asking, what do I want? What do I need? What version of me have I been silencing just to avoid losing them? And suddenly you start remembering. You remember the strength you had before they made you question it. You remember the dreams that got buried under all the emotional labor. You remember what it feels like to breathe without walking on eggshells. And it's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's powerful. Because every time you choose silence over self-betrayal, you reclaim a piece of your identity. Now here's what makes that silence even more potent. They feel it, not because you're making a statement, not because you're being cold, but because they've never had to face a version of you that's not wrapped around their comfort. You're no longer explaining your worth, you're embodying it. You're no longer chasing connection, you're becoming it. And that is the kind of energy that can't be controlled, because it's rooted in truth. Your truth, and the avoidant, they don't know what to do with that. Because their power came from your emotional availability. Their comfort came from your consistency, but now you're grounded. You're no longer moving based on their distance or closeness. You're no longer adjusting your emotional thermostat to match their fear of intimacy, and that neutrality, that calm strength, it's disarming. You didn't rage, you didn't beg. You just stopped performing, and they feel the gap. That space where your emotional labor used to live, it's empty now. And that emptiness reflects something back to them they've been running from their entire life. The reality that they don't know how to connect without someone else doing all the work. But you're done carrying that weight. You're done molding yourself into someone who's easier for them to digest. You're no longer willing to trade your peace for temporary closeness. And in that space you rise quietly, steadily, authentically. No more rehearsed conversations in your head. No more walking on emotional glass. Just you whole, seen, heard, even if only by yourself. Because when you stop chasing, you don't just break the cycle, you break free from the version of you that needed the chase to feel worthy. And what you step into next is a power they'll never be able to take from you again. There's a moment when everything inside of you shifts, when the energy you used to pour outward suddenly turns inward. You stop waiting for the text. You stop wondering what you did wrong. You stop needing answers from someone who's never been able to give them. And in that space, in that stillness, you realize something powerful. You don't need their validation, you need your own. And the second that clicks, the second you stop performing for their approval, is the moment you begin to tap into a kind of power you didn't even know you had. Because here's the truth, needing their validation was never about love. It was about survival, emotional survival. It was about trying to calm the storm that kept rising every time they pulled away. You thought if you could just be good enough, understanding enough, low maintenance enough, they'd finally see your heart and stay. But what you were really doing was trying to regulate your own fear through their approval. You weren't chasing them, you were chasing the feeling of safety that came with their brief moments of warmth. But that kind of safety is an illusion, and when you finally see it for what it is, inconsistent, conditional, and rooted in their avoidance, you get a chance to choose something better. You choose your power. Power doesn't scream, it doesn't chase, it doesn't beg, it doesn't try to fix someone who isn't willing to meet you. Power stands, it holds, it knows. And when you stop looking to them to validate your worth, you start embodying that worth. You stop sending emotional signals hoping they'll pick up on your pain. You stop explaining things to someone who doesn't want to understand. You stop handing your sense of peace to someone who never asked to carry it in the first place. And you know what happens then? Everything flips. The dynamic that used to keep you small collapses. You're no longer the one anxiously waiting for scrap of connection. You're the one deciding where your energy goes. You're no longer the one trying to prove you're lovable. You know you are, and that knowing is something they can't touch, can't manipulate, and can't control. It makes you unshakable. The avoidant wasn't used to that version of you. They were used to you showing up even when you were hurting. They were used to you over-explaining your feelings just to be met with indifference. They were used to you lowering your standards just to keep the peace. But when you step back, not in silence to punish, but in silence to protect your soul, it destabilizes their rhythm, because now they're not in control of your highs and lows, you are, and that changes everything. They may not say it. They may not even know how to process it, but deep down they feel the shift. They feel that the emotional chase is over, and now they're the ones left wondering, not because you're trying to get a reaction, but because you're no longer reacting at all. You're no longer chasing clarity from someone committed to confusion. And that silence, that calm, that centeredness, it speaks louder than any speech ever could. But the beauty of this moment isn't just in how it affects them. It's in what it builds inside of you. You begin to realize you don't need to be picked to feel valuable. You don't need to be chosen to feel whole. You don't need someone to mirror back your worth in order to believe in it. That's power. Not the kind that dominates or controls, but the kind that says, I am enough, even if you never see it. And that shift, it's magnetic. It draws in a different kind of energy, a cleaner kind, a more stable, grounded, real kind, and more importantly, it filters out the chaos you once mistook for passion. It creates space for love that feels safe, consistent, reciprocal, not love that keeps you guessing. So you stop playing the game. You stop needing to win them back. You stop trying to decode their distance, because you're no longer seeking connection to validate your existence. You're creating it from the inside out. And that kind of shift, that kind of power, that kind of silence, it can't be ignored. The most fascinating part of this whole dynamic is what happens inside their mind when you go quiet. Not when you threaten to leave, not when you dramatically walk out, but when you simply stop engaging, when you choose calm over chaos, when your voice fades not in anger but in clarity. That silence becomes louder than anything you ever said, and in that silence, something begins to unravel inside them, something they'll never admit, but can't escape. See, avoidants thrive when you're in pursuit. As long as you're chasing, they're safe. They get to hold the power. They get to feel wanted without having to be vulnerable. And when you pull away, when you no longer reach out, no longer text, no longer fight to be seen, it forces them into a space they don't know how to navigate. Uncertainty. And uncertainty for an avoidant is uncomfortable, because now they're not sure what role to play. They don't know how to interpret your silence. They start asking themselves questions they're not used to facing. Why aren't they reaching out? Did they stop caring? Are they with someone else? Did I lose them for good? These questions don't come because they've suddenly become emotionally available. They come because your absence created a void, and that void reflects something back to them they weren't ready to see. You were the source of emotional warmth. You were the one showing up. You were the anchor, and now that anchor is gone and they're drifting, they may still act cool. They may still post like nothing's changed, but don't be fooled by the performance. That silence is doing work. It's stirring up everything they've spent years burying, their fear of intimacy, their fear of being rejected, their belief that love means losing themselves, and all of that. It starts bubbling up the longer they don't hear from you. Now, here's what makes this powerful. They'll never say it. Most of the time they won't even know how to put it into words, but you'll see it in their hesitation, in their sudden check-ins, in the random, seemingly casual messages. Hey, just checking in. Saw something that reminded me of you. These aren't just about the moment. They're about trying to figure out if you're still there, if they still have access to you, if the game is still being played. And when they realize it's not, that the dynamic has changed, that's when the internal shift starts happening. They start reflecting, even if only in fragments. They start remembering the things you did, the effort you gave, the way you showed up, all the things they minimized, dismissed, or took for granted. And now, in your absence, they begin to feel the weight of that. They might not label it regret, but they feel the loss, and loss for an avoidant is confusing, because they worked so hard to maintain distance, and yet your absence feels heavier than your presence ever did. And what's even more important than what's going on in their head is what's happening in yours. Because while they're sitting with questions, you're sitting with answers. You're realizing that you never needed to explain yourself one more time. You never needed to send that long message hoping they'd finally understand. You never needed to perform emotional CPR on someone who was never willing to breathe life into the relationship themselves. You just needed to stop talking, stop fixing, stop rescuing, and in that space you got clarity. They may never say what they feel. They may never own their part, but don't underestimate what your silence triggered. It cracked the illusion. It disrupted the story they told themselves about you always being there. It forced them to sit with the very vulnerability they've been avoiding for years, and even if they try to run from it, that silence planted a seed of reflection, a seed of discomfort, a seed of potential change, because sometimes the loudest transformation happens in the quiet, and the greatest power play isn't saying one more thing, it's saying nothing at all. You didn't scream, you didn't fight, you didn't chase them down to prove a point, you just stopped, you got quiet. You didn't try to argue your value anymore. You didn't keep pushing for clarity from someone who only met you with confusion. You stopped explaining your worth to someone who didn't have the capacity to receive it. And that stillness, that choice to walk away from the game, not in anger, but in strength, that became the turning point. Not just for you, but for them, because they were never expecting you to stop. They built the entire connection on the belief that you'd always be the one to show up. You'd always be the one to reach back out. You'd always be the one to fix things when they started to fall apart. And for a while, maybe you did. You loved hard. You gave more than you got. You stayed longer than you should have. You made excuses for behavior that didn't match the depth of what you were offering. But there comes a moment when your soul gets tired, not of love, but of begging to be loved right. And that's when everything begins to change. They feel it. Maybe not at first, maybe not in the dramatic way you once imagined, but they feel the shift, because energy doesn't lie. They feel the absence of your effort, the absence of your emotional presence. They feel the weight of your silence, even if they pretend not to. And for someone who's spent their whole life avoiding intimacy, your stillness becomes a confrontation they can't run from. The space you created by stepping back becomes their mirror, and what they see, it's uncomfortable. They're left with their patterns, their fears, their wounds. You're no longer there to buffer them. You're no longer filling in the emotional gaps. You're no longer cushioning the impact of their avoidance. And in that space, they start to feel something they haven't had to feel before: responsibility, not just for losing you, but for avoiding themselves. See, growth doesn't happen in the noise. It happens in the void. It happens in the tension between what they thought they could control and what they realize they've lost. It happens when they're forced to sit with the truth that maybe they pushed away something real. Maybe they ran from the one person who actually saw them, accepted them, showed up when it wasn't convenient, and now that person isn't reaching anymore. Maybe they won't admit it. Maybe they'll move on quickly, or maybe they'll spiral in silence, trying to figure out what happened. But none of that is your concern anymore, because the point was never to change them. It was to change you. It was to choose you, to finally understand that love isn't about tolerating emotional starvation and calling it strength. Love isn't about constantly proving yourself to someone who's terrified of connection. Love is about truth, and your silence, that was the truest thing you ever did. Because in the end, you didn't just walk away from them, you walked back to yourself. And whether they grow or not, whether they come back or not, is irrelevant. What matters is that you didn't abandon yourself to hold on to someone who kept letting go. You didn't stay trapped in a cycle that made you feel smaller then you found your stillness, you found your strength, and that changed the entire story. It's easy to think silence is weakness, that not reacting is losing, but it's the opposite. Silence is the reset. It's the decision that says, I'm not lowering my voice anymore just so you can stay comfortable in your disconnection. It's not punishment, it's peace. It's not withdrawal, it's wisdom. It's not indifference, it's inner strength. And in that strength, you rewrote the ending, not with force, not with manipulation, not with drama, but with presence, with groundedness, with clarity. You didn't just take back your power, you rose into it, quietly, boldly, unapologetically, and that's the moment everything started to change. If this message hit you, don't just sit with it, act on it. Hit that subscribe button if you're done playing small. Share this with someone who needs to wake up. This is Tony-style motivation, where silence becomes strength, pain becomes fuel, and your comeback becomes unstoppable. Until next time, stay bold, stay grounded, and never chase what you were born to rise above.